You're listening to Discutafel, the podcast on eco-friendly gardening and permaculture. You've chosen to listen to another episode of Discutafel podcast, green audio from the Netherlands. Thank you for doing this. My name is Yvonne Smit. I'm founder and host of this podcast, and I'm very proud to have you as a listener. Welcome. I'm talking to you now from a small studio in 's-Hertogenbosch, a medieval town in the south of the country, but this summer I managed to make a safe trip up to the north, near Groningen, and there we visited a botanical garden. You might have heard part 1 of our coverage. It was released on October the 8th, and that was episode number 87, so you can still catch up with that episode. We ended the story then when entering the Celtic garden, and I keep referring to it as the Keltish garden. Sorry for that, my English isn't not perfect at all. But anyway, in this new episode 89, we go back to the garden again. And I released this episode on November 19, 2020. And now you can listen to the second part of the coverage. In this part, you'll hear me talking and experiencing the so-called succession garden or ecological garden. I had never visited a garden like this before. Most show gardens and gardens to visit, they are maintained to stay in a certain state. A new border here, a patio there, that's it, isn't it? But in this botanical garden near Groningen, we experienced fields of heather and meadows, which had been created just to develop by themselves. One of the head gardeners in the last century and the University of Groningen, they wanted to investigate the principle of ecological succession, which is somehow interesting and special for us gardeners, because I suppose that as a listener to Discutafel podcast, you consider yourself as a nature-friendly gardener, an eco-friendly gardener. But even though, I suppose you, like me, design your garden, you keep interfering in your plot, you bring new plants in, you make paths, you build patios. Essentially, gardening is interfering with natural development, isn't it? But a century ago, this head gardener and the University of Groningen, they developed these meadow garden and heather garden, and they called it an ecological garden. And according to the website of the botanical garden, it was the first ecological garden in the Netherlands. What became of these fields in 100 years' time? You'll soon find out. But let me first take you back to the Celtic garden. The Celts had their own way of looking at life. They thought trees had their own characteristics, and they compared these characteristics with human nature. The Celtic tree calendar is based upon 13 lunar months with fixed dates. Find your birthday and the tree that corresponds to it, and the character of the tree corresponding to your birthday may tell you something about yourself. Well, I don't know anything about the historical value of this calendar, but that doesn't matter in a garden podcast, does it? Imagine a big circle with a maze of hedges in the middle. And on the outskirts of this circle, you see tens of trees, all different species. Impossible to photograph, at least with a simple smartphone. And you might agree with that when you look at the picture I took. I published it in the show notes of this episode. But it was a remarkable experience. And which of these trees fits my birthday and perhaps my personality? Enjoy this coverage. Discu coverage. This is the tree calendar, the Celtic tree calendar, and it is a symbol of the way the Celts look at life and look at the characteristics of people. The tree calendar consists of a big circular terrain. We see 4 day trees, and they mark the seasons. And on the borders of the tree calendar we see tens of different species of trees, and they all have special characteristics, and they all belong to a certain period in time. We have the fig here. I'm here at the fig, and the fig is the sentimental tree. And this is for people who have been born between the 14th of June and the 23rd of June. And so we walk past all these different tree species. They all have their own characteristics. They all belong to a certain period of time. 10 days, I think. 10 days in the year. Cypress, the faithful one, belongs to people who have been born between the 26th of July and the 4th of August. Which will be my tree? Let's find out. My tree appears to be the Acer, and it's not. The personality is not very common. It says. I seem to have a rich fantasy. I'm original. Well. I'm proud. I like to have new experiences. And I can live very modestly when it's needed, when there's no other way to have a luxury life. It's no problem for me. I can live modest. But I'm also complicated. Also in my love life, it says. My physical and mental health is sometimes not too good. Well, I must admit, in some ways I do recognize myself in these characteristics, but in some ways not at all. The Acer is for people who have been born between the 14th of October and the 23rd of October. In the arboretum of the Hortus Botanicus Haren we find the deciduous trees of the northern hemisphere, and most of these trees are left untouched. That is to say, they can grow in the forms they like, and underneath the trees we find wood plants, various wood plants from the northern hemisphere. And next to the arboretum we find the pinnatum. That's the place where we find the trees with needles. And this pinnatum contains more than 150 species from all over the world. Nowadays, in the 21st century, probably the Celtic garden and the Chinese garden are the attract the most visitors here to the Hortus Botanicus Haren. But in the last century, there was a head gardener who had different plans with the garden. He wanted to show the principle of succession in nature. And that's why he had the plan to make the layout of 2 open fields here in the garden, and that's where I am now. In the background you hear some people, workmen, who maintain the garden. And these fields were the heather and meadow fields here. And what he intended to show, his name was Etsko Laarman, by the way, this head gardener. He was head gardener from 1921 until 1963, I believe, so a long time. And what he intended to show was the principle of succession in nature. What happens to grassland when you do nothing about it? It becomes a wood. You recognize this in your own garden. When you have the new layout of your garden and the new plants in your garden, and you keep your hands in your pockets and do nothing about it, it changes. Every year you see new plants, you see plants disappearing, you see plants you don't want. So gardening is stopping the principle of succession and maintaining the garden in a certain state. But that's not what he intended to show here. He intended to show what succession means, this ecologic principle of succession. So what do we see now? When we look in these open spaces, we don't see open spaces anymore. We see lots of trees. We see grasses, ferns, bushes, flowers. But we do not recognize the heatherlands anymore. We do not recognize the grasslands anymore. I think this is a very important part of the Hortus Botanicus Haren, but it needs a little bit of explanation to the general public. The public who walks past these fields, past this part of the garden, they see, well, what they see is a piece of nature, yes, but it looks like it hasn't been maintained at all, which is not the case, of course. I think in detail they know exactly the rare plant species who are here in the ground, but to the public they see familiar trees and plants and they pass by without noticing what's happening here. So most people come to the Celtic garden and the Chinese garden, and I hope they appreciate this part of the Hortus as well. Well, we're at the gate again after our first ever visit to the Hortus Botanicus Haren. And it was a pleasant visit. I found out that some of the experiences I had high hopes for were a little bit disappointing, like the Celtic garden. Of course, I enjoyed the tree calendar, but I imagined a bigger garden, more special, more mythical, really. And on the other hand, I didn't expect these grass and heather history of the garden the open spaces, the succession story demonstrated here. And I thought this was very pleasant to see and very educational. So if you ever happen to be near Groningen in the north of the country, I think the Hortus Botanicus is well worth a visit.
Discu finish.
According to the sign which accompanied my own tree, the Asa, this tree stands for overconfidence. And I must admit, I recognize one of my personal qualities here. So perhaps we can learn something from the Celtic tree calendar. We also visited the greenhouse in this botanic gardens, but it was a very hot summer's day, so inside the greenhouse it was very, very hot, and I didn't manage to make recordings there, but I did take a photograph or two, so please go to the show note to watch the photograph with colorful plants in the greenhouse. And while you're there, don't be scared of the big green monster, because I took a photograph of a big insect which I noticed in the grasslands in the gardens. Dutch listeners can look forward to a coverage in their own language at some time in 2021. Thank you all for listening to Discutafel podcast. Our next 2 episodes will be in Dutch, but if all goes according to plan, we'll meet in English again on the very last day of 2020. Take care, and in the meantime, let's go outside. And until next time.